you so much for showing up to join us for this webinar this afternoon. This is a webinar jointly sponsored by RI and HeartEdge, part of a new series that we're offering in 2022 after a successful run of webinars last year. So I suggest, I don't know what sort of morning you've had. I've had a very, very full morning. I'm guessing you may well have done too. Let's just begin by taking a few moments to remind ourselves of God's presence with us. So find a sort of comfortable position to yourself, maybe with your hands open. Take a few deeper breaths, and after a time of silence, I will pray for us. Gracious and glorious God, in this Easter season, we are reminded that Christ comes to us with a word of peace, of shalom and wholeness amidst all that is going on in the world. Grant us your grace and presence this afternoon and your blessing. In Christ's name, amen. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by 4 bishops from across 4 different Anglican provinces. Bishop Andrew, Bishop June, Bishop Kenneth and Bishop Robert. Let's have the 4 of you just sort of briefly sort of introduce yourselves. So Bishop Andrew, can we kick off with you?
Yes, so I'm Andrew Swift. I'm the Bishop of Brechin in the Scottish Episcopal Church, based in Dundee. It's called Bishop of Brechin because Brechin was the centre in 1150, but nowadays the city centre is Dundee, so I'm based out of there.
Fantastic. Great to have you with us, Bishop Andrew. And Bishop June.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bishop June. I'm the Bishop of Llandaff. If you don't know Wales, that's South Wales. Everything from Cardiff in the east to Swansea in the west, but it includes the Welsh valleys, post-industrial communities, some quite semi-rural communities, and some very urban, such as Cardiff, Barry, Port Talbot, Caerphilly. 60% of the population of Wales lives in my diocese.
Fantastic. Great to have you with us, Bishop June. And Bishop Kenneth.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kenneth Kieran. Recently I was the Bishop of Limerick and Killaloe. I retired at the end of October last year. I'm here really because our General Synod is in session today, and it's compulsory for serving bishops to be at that. So I was Bishop of Limerick and Killaloe, which is, if you don't know your geography, is the west and southwest of Ireland. Probably the largest diocese in terms of area, but also one of the smallest because it's all very small, scattered communities throughout the west of Ireland. The only city there would have been the city of Limerick, and the rest were very small towns and villages. So that's me.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bishop Kenneth. And I think also in this context, worth reminding ourselves that you had a role as Secretary General of the Anglican Communion. And so you've got that sort of a more global perspective that you bring from your experience as well.
Fantastic. That's right. I was 10 years as Secretary General. Before that, I was head of a college, a postgraduate college for reconciliation, which is now part of Trinity College, the Irish School of Ecumenics. So interestingly, until I became bishop, I hadn't worked for the Church of Ireland for over 16 years. So it was an interesting comeback.
Great to have you with us, Bishop Kenneth. And Bishop Robert.
Hello, I'm Robert Innes. I'm for the last 8 years, I've been the Church of England's bishop in Europe. I look after a diocese along with senior colleagues that covers some 42 countries, the whole of Europe plus Morocco, Turkey and Western Russia. So I do travel a great deal, and I have a direct interest in some of the pressing issues that are facing our continent at the moment.
Indeed, fantastic, and a real privilege to have you with us today, Bishop Robert. Thank you. Well, for those of you who might be sort of new to these webinars, this particular one is a follow-up to a conversation that we held a year ago. As I mentioned earlier, it's with bishops from 4 of the Anglican provinces of England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Bishop Andrew and Bishop June were part of last year's conversation, but we're delighted to have Bishop Kenneth and Bishop Robert adding into the conversation this year. It's worth, I think, just reminding ourselves that the last couple of years have been really seismic in global terms. We've had the COVID-19 global pandemic running since the beginning of 2020, with over 6 million people globally dying with the virus, and untold disruption to people's lives and to our economic systems in a whole variety of ways. And then since February this year, we've had a major war running in Ukraine, with over 5 million people fleeing to neighbouring countries, and another 6 or 7 million people being internally displaced within Ukraine, and countless thousands of civilian and military dead. And for those of us who are in the UK, the picture is complexified by the UK's departure from the European Union at the end of 2020. So the UK is trying to do its own thing apart from the EU. This afternoon, what we want to focus on is 3 aspects of the Church's response to some of what is going on in the world, and thinking particularly about how we might contribute to God's reconciling work through what the Church is doing. And we're going to focus on 3 different aspects. First of all, in relation to dealing with traumatic experience and loss. Secondly, in embracing new opportunities for advancing justice and equality. And third, in bridge building across national boundaries. Okay, so that's the plan, that's where we're heading, and a little bit of the context. So let's turn to the first of those aspects, dealing with traumatic experience and loss. The viral pandemic and the war in Ukraine have created a huge range of losses for many. This obviously includes loss of lives, but other losses as well, and I think including the loss of the sense that in Europe we live on a continent that's relatively safe and free from war. Whatever illusions we may have had about those have really been dispelled in the last few months. So my question for our bishops is, what do you and your churches have to offer people in facing and accepting recent losses? And Bishop Robert, I wonder whether you'd be willing to kick us off.
Thank you very much indeed, Alistair. I was reflecting on the fact that since I came to Belgium in 2005, a context which looked stable and positive and optimistic has become radically transformed. In 2008, we had a sovereign debt crisis, 2015, a major migration crisis from Syria. Then we've had Brexit, then COVID, and now war in Europe. And when I came to this post, I never imagined that I'd see war within the territory that I oversee. It's not surprising that people have characterized our time as an age of anxiety. We live with unpredictability and uncertainty and stress, and those lead many people to live in a state of continuous or sometimes heightened anxiety. I've been preaching a lot recently on John chapter 20, the second resurrection appearance of Jesus. We meet a group of disciples locked in a room for fear of the Jews. Jesus comes into that situation. He shows them his hands and his side, and he speaks a double peace to them. Peace be with you. And it's interesting that is repeated. And I think that's because Christ offers not just the absence of the negatives of fear and anxiety and war, but comes to bring the positive peace of shalom and wholeness and reconciliation and fullness. And then he says to the disciples, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. The church is to be a community of people who follow Christ, who imitate his life, and who bring that sense of peace and wholeness, shalom and reconciliation in the way that he did. And we see in that passage, as they're commissioned to go out in the power of the Spirit, a transformation, a group of people who are closed and locked in on themselves, fearful, to a group who are open to the world, who go out in the power of the Spirit with the message of the gospel. And that does seem to me what the church in our time is called to embody in itself. to take people from that situation of being closed in on themselves, fearful, isolated, to being open to the world and instruments of reconciliation. For us, and in our church context, the first thing is to be a community which is able to do that, which embodies love and peace in itself. I mean, it was Aristotle who said it's the community that cures, and we are a community of faith. And one of the big drivers of fear and anxiety is loneliness. People who are isolated from each other, and loneliness is one of the great crippling factors of our time. So by being a community and sustaining community, we act against loneliness directly. During COVID times, we've had to reimagine the way we do that. So our diocese, like every diocese, has been networking via Zoom, worshipping via Zoom, and we amazed ourselves to discover that that is possible and that people can join in. We've had to work hard at contacting people by telephone, by ensuring that elderly and vulnerable people are not forgotten and left behind. So sustaining community in difficult times, sustaining the community of faith, and then reaching out in various ways. And how does the church do this? Well, one example, a friend of mine who's a hospital chaplain, she's a young lady, and her curacy didn't work out, but she was invited to be a hospital chaplain for a year. And she found herself visiting patients sick with COVID. And because she was young, she was able to continue doing that work when the older and more experienced people were no longer allowed to do it. And she found herself visiting patient after patient at the end of their lives, and often the last person to be with them at the end of their lives. And that's where the church and its pastoral outreach work is so important and so powerful in situations of extreme fear and anxiety. I'm chair of governors of a university college, and our college, I'm fairly proud to say, we took care of our students, providing pastoral care, online teaching, online social events, online interaction with each other in a way that some of the other bigger universities simply didn't do. And I think that's been an important testament to the way we reacted to crises. The Ukraine war has been a devastating thing for our continent. We're only a very small church relative to some others, but we've held weekly prayer gatherings across Europe to provide solidarity and support to our parishioners from Kyiv in particular. And I know those have been deeply appreciated. And we have gathered folk from both Russia and Ukraine in those prayer gatherings. So those are some of those ways practically that we have sought to reach out in both being a community of faith for ourselves, supporting one another, but then also endeavouring to support and sustain those who are in particular need outside their community.
Great, thanks very much, Bishop Robert. And so my sense is that, yes, in a sense, you're partly responding to what the church can offer amidst the losses that are being faced. Let's turn to Bishop June. What thoughts have you got on what you and your churches can offer people in facing and accepting recent losses?
Thank you very much, Alistair. Well, I want to build on what Bishop Robert has just said, but let me first of all say that it seems to me that every Christian, every community is facing actually three dragons. You've mentioned two of them, which is the coronavirus and conflict. But there's also the climate crisis, which we are having to deal with. The good thing about those dragons is that they're all of them too big for any one person or institution to feel they can get a handle on them. And so we're all in a situation of not knowing quite how to cope. And therefore, how we think about them really matters, you know, where we start in framing our responses. And I've got three quick points which build, as I say, on what Bishop Robert said. The first one is about perspective, that we have a way of interpreting the story of trauma, which is really strong and has been with us for a very long time. We call it salvation history. But, you know, all the biblical material is about adversity and lament, and how faith matters in the face of overwhelming events. And I think that one of the things that the West is very bad at, really, is about being in touch with its own history. And so learning, I mean, I meet people who have no idea that the Spanish pandemic took off, you know, tens, hundreds of thousands of people, even almost within, I'm celebrating my mother-in-law's birthday today, who's 95, and she almost remembers the Spanish flu pandemic. So it's both about being in touch with past resilience, but also knowing how to interpret it. The second one is about pastoral care, that I think all trauma is transformed if we find comfort and compassion and community and companionship within it. And every church community can mobilize itself for that. And the third one is practical responses. Bishop Robert's given a few examples that he's been involved with. Let me just give you one or two. I want to put a plug in for Christian Aid Week that's coming up in the UK, 15th to the 21st of May, because Christian Aid, of course, was born out of a refugee crisis. And indeed, Christian Aid can rightly take some credit for having set up the Disasters Emergency Committee many decades ago. I think having a ecumenical response across the churches in the form, I think we underestimate the importance of Christian aid. Here in Cardiff, we had, do you remember not that long ago, the focus was on Afghanistan and the refugees from that conflict. 150 children arrived in Cardiff one weekend, and it was a church school that took those 150 in and gave them about half a term of care and getting them into the education system before they were then distributed out to other schools. And I've been involved with, I don't know whether you saw the publicity that the Elijah World Religious Leaders, which is an interfaith group of people who for some years now have been building strategically on interfaith friendship. A group went in Holy Week to Ukraine. I didn't feel I ought to lead the diocese in Holy Week, so I sent Archbishop Rowan Williams instead. And he very kindly went to Ukraine, and we did a message of solidarity, a broadcast from the cathedral here to the interfaith leaders who were meeting in Ukraine. Now there's an example of how friendship, just simply networking across boundaries can, I had an email yesterday from the rabbi who organized it, and he was very full of what the importance, the impact of that solidarity had meant.
That's lovely, Bishop June, and I think we'll pick that up a little bit later in the conversation as well, the importance of that bridge building across both international boundaries, but also I think ecumenical and interfaith boundaries is also relevant. Bishop Kenneth or Bishop Andrew, either of you like to offer a response to what you've heard from June and Robert?
Well, okay. I very much welcome what they both said. I note both of them started from the fact of community. And during the pandemic, a lot of communities in society just fell apart, and they're now trying to rebuild them and so on. But the Christian communities, the churches, actually are defined by being a community, and they continue to be a community throughout the pandemic and so on. And that's not to be taken lightly. That's a tremendous gift that the churches adapted within days, as Robert said, with things we never expected to be able to do, services by Zoom and prayers by WhatsApp and sharing all sorts of messages and telephones and so on. And the church showed itself to be a community that actually can express itself in a multitude of ways. And that was a very good learning experience for us. Also, the gift of peace, which Robert talked about, is rooted in a theology. It's easy to be platitudinous about peace in the situation today, but actually peace and hope are big theological concepts, and we need to express them in a very theological way, because I think that's what will actually resonate with people. And again, I'll talk about a local experience. I live on the East Coast now, and there was a drowning tragedy with helicopters and all sorts of things recently. And a woman died who was a teacher at the school, the church school up the road from me, a member of the congregation, well-known member of the community, and a huge funeral that flowed all into all those streets. But on Sunday, the rector decided to preach about that funeral. The funeral had taken place during the week. And he rooted it in the theological hope that is rooted in the Easter message. And it was so effective. Once he began, a couple of people walked out saying they couldn't face listening to, talking more about this woman who had died. But actually those who stayed, he was able to help people to frame the sense of tragedy into the message of Christian hope, which is rooted in Easter. And he did it without platitudes and without cliches or anything like that. He just spoke very straight, and he actually calmed that congregation who were still distraught by that. And that's a gift we can give to people, but it has to be a really properly worked out theology of peace, not in the jargon, a theology of hope, which leaves the jargon aside, actually talks straightforwardly in ordinary language about the Easter message of hope and of peace for everyone.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks. Thanks, Bishop Kenneth. And for me, that ties in with what Bishop June was saying about being part of a story that is not unfamiliar with death and trauma and loss, but a story that actually has entered into all that those mean, and has, through the grace of God, discovered that there is life beyond death, and that there is a story that we are part of that isn't limited by death and loss. And understanding the story that we're part of and that we're inviting others into seems significant in that. Bishop Andrew, anything you'd like to kind of add or pick up on from any of what you've heard so far?
No, I don't think I'd add a lot. That's been really excellent reflections on where we are. I'd probably just pick up the fact that, as well as us helping others with trauma and loss, our own churches, the communities, the institution is also handling its own trauma and loss. And I know I'm meeting a lot of things within our structures, within our own people, of coming to terms with that as they also minister to others. But I'd probably not go further than that, just observing we're not remote from it, offering comfort and peace. We're looking for healing ourselves. We're in it looking for that as well.
Yeah, and I think that for me that seems really significant, Bishop Andrew, that actually we can't pretend this isn't something that the church, particularly in these nations of Britain and Ireland, are facing, which is recognizing there is stuff that is coming to an end. There are things that are dying in our midst. We're not divorced from that reality. Fantastic, thank you all. Well, let's move the conversation to the sort of second aspect of what we were going to pick up, and I think it will connect in with some things that have been shared, but about exploring opportunities for justice and equality in the midst of what's happening. We've already noticed that the viral pandemic has been sort of massively disruptive, and that disruption is obviously now being compounded by the war in Ukraine. And all sorts of ways that disruption is manifesting itself in terms of energy supplies in Europe, for just one example. But the sort of disruption we've been facing can also present opportunities for contributing to a greater sense of justice and equality in our world. And my sense is that that's one of the things that's come a bit more sharply into focus through the time of the pandemic, is social inequalities actually being laid bare a bit more evidently. And I think the current cost of living crisis is sort of adding to that. And so my second sort of question for each of you is, what opportunities for contributing to greater justice do you and your churches need to embrace at this time? And Bishop Kenneth, I wonder if we can start with you in Ireland.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's probably in Ireland, but I think probably in the rest of in the United Kingdom as well. The pandemic in particular put huge pressure on our health services and also on our education system. And both of them were actually turned upside down within weeks by the pandemic. You know, at the health services, the way in which our hospitals transformed. All sorts of things, a lot of private hospitals were just taken into public management during the crisis, very, very fast. Suddenly GP clinics became very different places, and so on. And then our education system that was turned upside down by having to teach remotely and so on. And the war in Ukraine has created a huge refugee crisis. In the Republic, we've responded differently along with the rest of Europe. And we've had about a small country, we've had 30,000 refugees at the moment. They're arriving at the rate of 300 or 400 a day. And that's put huge pressures on our health service, on our education system, but also now on our housing, which was always a difficulty for us. And people in those three sectors are talking continually about the fact that it'll never be the same again. Our health service, our education system, our system of housing will never be the same again. But I think it's very important that as we seek to rebuild these in society, that they are rebuilt in a way that is more just and more equitable in the way in which they express themselves in society. And I think the churches have a major role to keep reminding society of the need to rebuild things differently and in a more just and equitable way. In Ireland, the churches don't get much of a hearing now because of the collapse of the Catholic Church in many ways. They don't go as much at a national level, but they are hugely influential at community level. And we've got quite a system. Most schools in Ireland, most primary schools are church-based. So a Church of Ireland diocese and most Church of Ireland parishes would have the church school. And the church school can often be it's got a role within a community, but can also have a role of leadership or shaping a response at a community level. So the way the local primary school responds to Ukrainian refugees coming, newcomers, the whole changes that were needed in order to get, for example, putting translation and voluntary translators into classes is a widespread thing. So the way in which the schools, and we do have a role in that because clergy are generally the chairs of the board of management of schools, can actually be very simple ways to express profound changes in society. Because very often it's the kids in the primary school, and they come home and they say they got a great Ukrainian friend and they're going around to some Ukrainian family who are living in the community, actually helps to transform the whole community's attitude. So I think we have to play this one carefully. I'm not saying we're doing great with it. But at community level, to put the emphasis on housing and justice and equality in housing in the way in which the health service is being reshaped in this country and in the way education system. The Northern Ireland hasn't had the same influx of Ukrainian refugees, as you probably know. I think there's actually only 600 have been given visas so far for Northern Ireland, compared with about 30,000 in the Republic. But there are opportunities there, but I'm not sure that we're conscious of the need to focus on equality in the way in which these needs are being addressed and the way in which basic structures in society about housing and health and education are actually being reshaped because of the pandemic and because of the Ukrainian refugee situation.
Thank you, Bishop Kenneth. And one of the things I really like about what you've shared, because it resonates with our Reconciling Mission program, which is the sort of big, long 18-month program we run, is the importance of what happens at the local level. And that actually focusing on what happens in our local primary schools, our local parish, and seeing that actually that's where we can have some influence and have some impact, and not underestimating how that can have a ripple effect, but that, you know, we should focus on what is within our reach and what is within our locality. So thank you. Bishop Andrew, let's come to you next on opportunities for contributing to greater justice that you and your churches you might need to embrace at this time.
Yep, no, thank you. And the whole context of this session that you've given us, Alistair, feels like the overwhelming opportunity to just say what is unjust in the world, where I suppose we're post-ish the pandemic. We're sort of, but not really. And again, that's a slightly political thing. Each country has a slight political slant on the pandemic. The cost of living crisis, which is that the pandemic? Is that the war in Ukraine? Is that Brexit? Is it, you know, who knows? Then the war in Ukraine, and just all of those issues all need a prophetic voice to cry out about them. So I suppose our most basic call as churches, whether it's in the local area or as bishops, to be a voice that will challenge easy assumptions or apathy maybe from those in power. And the issue is sometimes finding the ways to object to power being misused or maybe not being used at all, where things don't seem to be being done. And doing it in the name of the gospel. We're doing it because of God's loving kindness. We're doing it for theological reasons, because we want the world to be a sign of the kingdom of heaven. There's always the question, it's always struck me, does anyone care? As Bishop Kenneth was saying, in the church in Ireland generally, you can lose a lot of the authority or the right to make prophetic statements, moral statements, and we have to earn that right. I was really struck by the recent challenge on things like the scheme to move asylum seekers to Rwanda, and I think the bishops who serve in the House of Lords have been really effective, the English bishops, in standing up and saying that they're not very keen on that. And a lot of the response to that about how dare bishops get involved in politics, which in England, well, they are. But you know, Jesus was political. He was involved in all of that. I know I'm a part of a fairness leadership group here in Dundee. We have major issues with drugs, with fuel poverty, with food poverty. And there's a group of civic leaders and people who live in the community who gather together to try and lay bare what's going wrong. And I was delighted that as a church leader, I was invited to be part of that. And I did ask them why. So why did you invite me to be part of this? And they said, if you write something, it'll get in the papers. So they want a prophetic voice. They want something that will, you have to spell everything properly and get it in for the submission dates and all that kind of stuff. But there is a place for the church to own a little bit of that that prophetic voice, to use the communication tools we do have. But trying to be relevant, that's one of the challenges for us. There are prophetic things that need to be said, but we as a church need to be relevant. If we're just perceived as a gathered society for people with a leisure interest in religion, which is sometimes what, you know, when you do a census, you can feel that's the perception a little bit of what we are, rather than the body of Christ in the world, a transforming agency. And I suppose it is our calling to be unpopular. So to be unpopular with those in power, people who seem to be complacent, using social media, local press, and that can feel a bit of a contrast to trying to be an institution that's trying to constantly be more attractive and flexible and market yourself and be popular and connected. I know young people really connect with environmental and social justice issues, but in our pews up in Scotland, some of the older folk on the pews who actually pay for the whole thing are quite uncomfortable when we're that prophetic voice and say that things are wrong and they should be challenged. So we have to constantly navigate this challenge of being a pastoral church, communities that take care but are willing to be unpopular enough to have the prophetic edge and challenge those things in the hope that someone will care that we're challenging them. That's it. Will someone actually care we do it? So no, thanks, Alistair.
Thank you, Bishop Andrew. And for me, one of the striking things in what you've shared there is the need for there to be a sort of consistency between what's happening inside the church and what we're looking to challenge or offer outside the church, and to recognise sometimes there is some internal conflict there, as you've just named, and for us to recognise, okay, that's part of what we've got to deal with, is to address some of those internal tensions in the life of the church if we're going to have that consistency between what the message we're looking to proclaim and what we're actually living out. Bishop June or Bishop Robert, either of you like to respond to what you've heard from Kenneth or Andrew there?
Yes, thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you both, Bishops Kenneth and Andrew, for very interesting and provocative insights into these areas. I remember in the earlier times of the COVID crisis, people saying COVID is the great leveler, And I suppose what they meant was that in the face of death, we're all the same, or in the face of very serious illness, whether you're rich or poor, you're going to be very ill or you may die. But of course, that was a lie. COVID was not the great leveler. In fact, COVID pointed up deep social inequalities in society. And Kenneth referred to housing and education. If you had a big house and your children went to private schools, COVID lockdowns meant very different things from if you lived in a tenement block and your children went to a tough comprehensive school. The experience of COVID was really very different, and it pointed up deep inequalities in Britain. And I often say to my Episcopal colleagues, inequality in Britain is higher than it is in other Northern European countries. And housing, as Bishop Kenneth mentioned, is one of the big issues. There are far too many people living in very inadequate housing in Britain. The prophetic voice of the church is, as Bishop Andrew said, vital, but needs to be backed up by consistent practice within the church. So to talk about Ukraine, we felt it was really important as a diocese to launch our own appeal for Ukraine, and we raised, I think to our surprise, we've raised £250,000 as a diocese, which is going on aid to Ukrainians and to those in nations bordering Ukraine, which we have felt was important to give some credibility to our desire to pray and to speak prophetically. But what I have noticed with the Ukraine crisis is the degree to which huge numbers of people have come in behind support for Ukrainian refugees. You can go, I was going around parts of southern England recently, and there were Ukrainian flags everywhere. Southwest Rail had a Ukrainian day when all the staff wore blue and yellow. I don't remember anything much like this, where a whole population has got behind this social cause, caring for Ukrainians and for refugees. And my hope would be that that could spread to a changed attitude to migration in general. How is it that we feel so warm and sympathetic to Ukrainians and so hostile to those who try to get across the channel from Calais? And how can we point out the hypocrisy in that stance as a church and lead to a transformation in attitudes to desperate refugees and migrants and asylum seekers in general?
Yeah. Fantastic, thank you, Robert. And I think that there is a real disconnect there, as you're pointing to, between some of the response to Ukrainian refugees and what's going on with our national policy and what the current government in the UK have been elected on, and the types of policies they're trying to implement in relation to migration. There's a real disconnect there. Bishop June, anything you'd like to add?
Just one comment really, which is as a church, if we really want to take equality and injustice seriously and head on, we have got to take more seriously the leadership of the young in our life. And the church in Wales did some work last week at its governing body on our aspiration to get to net zero carbon by 2030. And as I looked at this action plan, I thought, you know, this would do so much better if it was put into the hands of those who are under 30 in our community. I was sitting talking about it with a group of people on the governing body, all of whom I think were older than me. And one of the experiences I've had as a bishop is how much we disempower, and we were talking about church schools earlier. Some of the most, the greatest scrutiny I face as a bishop comes when I go into a church school and the children ask me questions because they're shameless and they see, you know, never mind about being relevant, you have to be authentic as well with children. And if you take the statistic that most people in our churches came to faith, 75% of people in our churches came to faith before the age of 18. That's the statistics we're working on. Why don't we take the leadership of children and young adults more seriously in our churches? Because if it's my generation who've got the hand on the tiller of justice and equality, it's going to go a lot slower and a lot less impressively than if we give it to people under 30.
And my sense is that ties in with what Bishop Andrew was saying in terms of a challenge facing, and I don't know this is peculiarly an Anglican thing, but I think it is particularly a problem or challenge within the Anglican churches in Britain and Ireland, is that, you know, the critical mass of our congregations are people who are much older. They're also the ones who are providing most of the finance to enable the churches to survive. But the sort of the hope for the future is with the younger generations who we are not seeing flooding into our churches. Yeah, I don't know if any of you wants to pick up on that or to offer an observation or comment on that. A stunned silence.
I think it's general agreement. I mean, I think June has said is very, very true. And we aren't good at shifting the focus. And the trouble is we always do it, we don't do it in a sustained, if we do try, we don't do it in a sustained way. So it becomes a sort of a novelty when we listen to younger people, the younger generation, for a while, and then lapse back into our more traditional ways of doing things. But she's quite right. If we were to genuinely hand responsibility for particularly the environmental future of the churches to a generation who will be affected by it, it will be a very, very different scenario. Of course it would.
Yeah, and I don't know if any of you have got sort of illustrations sort of where, in a sense, you have been able to really engage well and to listen well to younger generations. Is this sort of prompting anything?
This is, Alistair, this may be taking us in a direction you don't want to go, but, you know, when we were young, the church was busy planting churches in areas which were newly developed. You know, take somewhere like the Longbridge car plant in Birmingham, where it was fields until the car industry took Longbridge over. And so the church quite rightly planted churches there. And we all have examples of the way church planting has followed the demographics of. One of the things we have to do in this generation, I think, is we have to plant in the world of young people in a different kind of way. It's not an invention, it's not new to us. So that, for instance, in Cardiff, when I arrived, we have somewhere between 60 and 80,000 students in Cardiff, because we have 3 universities. And there wasn't a single Anglican church with a critical mass of students in it. We now have a church which we planted last year. It has about 500 under 30s in the congregation. And that's simply because it's designed around the way those young people want to live and behave and think. Now we're going to carry on planting for that age group across the diocese, and we just simply have to recognise that they are not going to turn up at our traditional parishes, but we desperately need them in the governance, in the prophetic direction of our church, because they will grasp issues of inequality and social justice with much greater determination.
And I think that's fantastic to hear, Bishop June. I think the question it leaves me with is then how do we enable the sort of multi-generational dialogue and encounter? Because it's fantastic to start and plant a new church which is really geared for young people, but in many ways I think one of the strengths that the church can have and should have is of a kind of multi-generational conversation that happens from being part of the same body together, that's often missing in our society, but that can be a source of hope, I think, for the future. And I'm not expecting any of you to necessarily answer that question now, but I think that's one for us to sort of keep pondering. Well, I want to just thank everybody who's sort of come on the call. Really appreciate your engagement with us so far. What we want to do now is just to give you a chance to have a little bit of conversation in groups of 2 or 3. And there's 2 questions I've got for you for the breakout conversations that you're going to have. First of all, what has really resonated for you from what you've heard? What's resonated? And secondly, what would you want to add to what you've heard from our 4 bishops? So Debbie, if you're able to sort of post those in, but I hope that's been useful for you as a way just to sort of process something of what you've heard and help keep you engaged for the sort of final part of the conversation. We're heading for finishing at 3:30, and everything's on track for that. But really appreciate you sort of hanging in there till the conclusion of the conversation. So we're going to move to reflect on the sort of third and final part of the aspects I mentioned at the beginning, which is about building bridges across national boundaries. And whilst you were in your breakout groups, we were having some interesting conversation about that among ourselves. But I think it's worth noting that the pandemic provoked an increase in tensions between nations and a stronger focus on defending national interests. The EU really came under strain during the pandemic in terms of trying to maintain a sort of consistent line. And within the British and Irish context, this has obviously been really exacerbated by the UK's exit from the European Union at the end of 2020, and a sense of the UK wanting to go it alone in some way. But we've also seen greater strains in the ties that bind the countries which form the United Kingdom together. For just a small example of that is the different approaches taken to COVID-related regulations. And as I say, we were just chatting about that whilst everyone was in the breakout groups. And I think now with the war in Ukraine, the UK's current Prime Minister has wanted to try to advance national interest by moving ahead of the EU in supporting the government of Ukraine with military aid. And the flip side of that, though, is, as we've kind of noted already, in terms of welcoming Ukrainian refugees, certainly the English, the government has been sort of struggling to kind of deal with even where the population is at, and certainly compared with EU neighbours, particularly obviously the nations who are closest to Ukraine, who've had extraordinary sort of generous welcoming. So how does this look from each of the 4 different contexts that the 4 of you are in? Bishop Robert, why don't we kick off with you, because you're in Brussels at the moment. How does this look from your perspective?
So Brexit, Ben. Well, Brexit is part of a phenomenon across Europe of growing support for right-wing or populist politics, which we've seen elsewhere in Hungary, in Poland, in Austrian Netherlands to some degree, and most recently in the relative success of Marine Le Pen in the French presidential elections. Thankfully, Marine Le Pen was not elected president, because if she had been, that could very well have been the end of the European Union. I believe that Brexit was a wholly misguided and deeply regrettable and unfortunate political move at a time when Britain could have been a leader within Europe and indeed was looked to as a leader by other countries. Instead, the country took a step backwards and inwards into the creation of some kind of nostalgic vision of an allegedly globally orientated, disguised kind of quasi-imperial past. So that's where we are now. Alistair, you referred to the different response between Britain and Europe in regard to the refugee crisis, and that's absolutely true. The response of Poland has been absolutely magnificent. They've taken in 3 million refugees. Bear in mind that Poland is not a rich country. Polish people do not live in big houses, and they don't have high incomes. Across Europe, we've offered free rail transport to Ukrainians who want to move to different countries, and there have been no visa restrictions, whereas it's expensive to fly, to travel to England, for example, and the visa regulations, despite what the Home Office says, have been onerous. How does it all look? Well, my sense is, I think I'm trying to be realistic. My sense is that Europeans do distinguish between the British people and the UK's current administration. In the fullness of time, there will need to be new ways of working between the EU and the UK, but I don't see much likelihood of progress under the UK's current political administration.
Yeah, and I think it's worth being really honest and realistic about that, Bishop Robert, so thank you. Bishop Kenneth, what about from your location in Ireland?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'd certainly echo much of what Robert has said about Brexit. From a point of view of Irish-British relationships, Brexit has been a disaster. And that was a disaster at a time when actually relationships were really improving hugely. I mean, we all are aware of the history and a fairly ambivalent relationship between the two islands. But in recent years, really since the Good Friday Agreement, serious efforts have been made on all sides to develop the North-South, which is Northern Ireland and the Republic, and East-West, which is Ireland, the island of Ireland and the island of Great Britain. And those were received enormous focus when the Queen visited Ireland on a trip which was fraught with tension before it happened, and turned out to be a runaway success with huge crowds and a huge welcome. And I think the Queen herself enjoyed it. And that was returned with a state visit by our president, the first one to London, and being hosted by the Queen. And that was a high point. That was 2011. And relationships really, that was so a palpable improvement in relationships. And Brexit was a bit of a disaster. And I think the way the negotiations were handled wasn't helpful. What it did do was it pushed Ireland to decide between where its future relationships were. And I think it has turned very, very decidedly European and towards Europe. And that's had a weakening and a not very good relationship with Britain, I think. And that's just very sad. And we see it in the shops and so on. We no longer use Amazon.uk, for example. People go to the German Amazon website in Ireland because of the hassle of getting, because of duties and all sorts of things like that. My wife and I were in the city centre in Dublin yesterday, and we actually noted the number of British brands which were no longer available or easily available, and that's not a good thing, you know, in the long term. The Ukrainian situation has also, in a sense, put it to us strongly: are we European or not? Are we going to align with what other European countries have done by way of refugees, and again, which Bishop Robert talked about? And we've tried, I think, to align very much there. We don't have visa requirements and so on. But it has been hard in our society. There's no doubt about that. We don't have visa requirements. They can work immediately. They get a number. As soon as they arrive at the airport, they get a, well, the equivalent of what you'd call a national insurance number. We call it PPN number. and it gives you access, it allows you to work, it gives you access to all the medical facilities, education, school, and so on. And you just get one on arrival if you're a Ukrainian. You just get one, and then that's valid for 3 years. And during those 3 years, the thing will be sorted out. We don't in Ireland have the sort of nationalist feelings that are spreading throughout Europe and as part of the Brexit thing. I think the opposite at the moment. We're very, very pro-European. And that's the mood at the moment. But I think there's a sort of an unhealthy distancing from Britain and the government at the moment, which is not good for the long term. It certainly isn't. And it isn't helping. It's made things much worse in Northern Ireland, with our relationship in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And again, they were going very, very well. And it's just messed that situation up as well.
Great. Thank you, Bishop Kenneth. What about north of the border in Scotland, Bishop Andrew?
Yeah, this feels like a creeping death of all the political issues facing the United Kingdom and Ireland at the moment. So Scotland, again, overall, I think it was 62% voted against Brexit in Scotland, which means 38% did vote for it. So that's a significant minority that did vote for it. One of the strong arguments used in Scotland for not having independence in our previous election was that if we left the United Kingdom, that would take us out of Europe, and there wasn't a guaranteed way back into it. So there was a strong argument that said, vote against independence if you want to remain European. So that whole argument has slightly unraveled between the different independence referendums. And then the pandemic has been very, very politicized. The fact that the pandemic has been handled differently in each of the nations, and the Scottish approach to the pandemic has probably been slightly more risk averse than, say, the Westminster. I've no idea about the Welsh or the Irish, because after a while I had to stop looking at other countries, because you just had to understand your own. You couldn't really do the comparative theology between them all. The other side of that is our SNP administration have been in power for quite a long time now. And when an administration has been in power for quite a long time, actually things aren't that great anymore. There's Ferrygate, and there's bad school education gate, and there's poor drugs in dealing with the drug issues in the country. There's a whole lot of issues that an administration who've been there for a long time begin to come up against, and it would be healthy to have a change. But there isn't any way our elections this Thursday will be the parties fight to see who can be second to the SNP. That's the political goal of the other parties in Scotland. And there isn't a credible alternative because of that polarization of it. So it's an uncomfortable place to be at the moment, particularly when everyone's tired, coming out the pandemic, feeling jaded, feeling the pinch. It is a hard place to be. But there will be pressure for another independence referendum coming from the Scottish government, who got their mandate for that in the last election. So they feel they had a mandate. But it's an uncomfortable place to be at the moment. Definitely uncomfortable.
And uncomfortable is definitely a word, a thread that's running through the three voices we've had so far. Bishop June.
Well, it's very similar in Wales, really. We have a different political settlement than lies over the border in England, as I'm sure you're aware, between the Labour Party and Plaid Cymru. There is a steady left-leaning inclination. The Welsh, of course, Wales is very used to being effortlessly patronised by England, the language, the Welsh Language Act has made a real difference. Both devolution and the Welsh Language Act has helped enormously, and so in many ways, I think of Wales as a small independent nation already. I know that's not the economic reality, but when I go to places like Estonia, I see what Wales might become in the future. You know, and I'm a great crusader, really, for Welsh leadership creating a future. Political future for Wales. Two comments really. One is, do England know? As somebody who moved into Wales, I feel ashamed of the fact that I lived, not 70 miles from the border of Wales for 25 years of ministry, and I had absolutely not a clue as to what it felt like to step over into Wales when I lived in Wiltshire. I mean, that is of course the downside of thinking that you are in the ascendancy, that you are the power, that you don't take a lot of trouble to actually think yourself into what it feels like over the border. And the other is just really a challenge that I put to myself, which is I don't think the church is working hard enough at thinking about what global migration is about. Because, the movement of people is now with us as a fact of life. And I think, I speak for myself, I think I have been lazy about thinking what the implications of that are, so that the illustration somebody gave earlier that, we've all been mobilized about Ukraine in a way that we never were about Syria or Afghanistan. I think we need to step up to some of that conversation together.
Thank you, Bishop. Well, that's a really good segue into sort of my final question for the four of you, which is about sort of the church's role in helping to bridge some of the tensions between national boundaries, but that doesn't exclude the church being an advocate for national independence within the UK. I don't think, but you could pick that up. And what particularly might you contribute in that as a bishop, I guess, is also a question for each of you. Yeah, so how do you see your church's role in bridging some of the tensions across national boundaries, and what as a bishop do you think, what part can you play? Who's, no particular order here, so who's willing to pick up the baton first?
I think in a sense we in the Church of Ireland were through this during the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where roughly 3/4 of the people in the Church of Ireland live in Northern Ireland, and about 1/4 live in the Republic. But there was, as the Troubles in the 70s and 80s, were really, the violence was very heavy, those tensions between North and South were beginning to show in the church itself. And I think there had to be a fairly concerted effort in the late 70s and into the 80s as a church to try to build bridges within our own church across the political divide, as they call it, or North-South in him. And we did it in various ways, and some were a lot more successful than others. Parishes and so on were twinned, and there were trips and bus trips up and down and all that sort of thing. And they were quite effective, because once people relax with one another, spend time, they actually don't want to talk about politics, but they're happy enough to enjoy the day, and that actually works. Remember, we have a fair number of clergy, particularly from the Church of England, but also from Wales and Scotland, ministering in Ireland. That's always been a long tradition out here. When I was in Limerick and Killaloe, I would say about 50%, maybe more, 60% of our clergy were not Irish, and most of them were from other parts of the United Kingdom. But others would be, Canadian and from the United States, South Africa, and so on. So we already have that, and that's quite a useful vehicle into just general conversations. So there is some resource there, and we found that quite a powerful thing as well. The body that was probably most successful at those cross-border visits was the Mothers' Union, and they had a much, as they often do, they're much more ground up, bottom-up approach to it, with very small groups of members of Mothers' Union going to stay for a while in the homes of others in another part of Ireland and just spend some time. And then we more recently, as we talked as a House of Bishops, we were talking about the fact that we're beginning not to understand the political and social context that one another lives in, North-South. the huge changes, social changes in the Republic in recent years, and obviously changes in Northern Ireland as well. So we've had to, we started a program where bishops would spend a weekend in different dioceses and just spend time and just minister and do whatever you wanted to, or visit all sorts of people, preach on a Sunday and so on. And that was actually very more worthwhile than we expected. At the end of it all, we would have a service in one of the cathedrals, evensong on the Sunday afternoon to sort of conclude the thing. And parishioners around the diocese were invited to it. And frankly, we weren't expecting that many to come. You know, a Sunday afternoon to sort of see a performance of the whole House of Bishops in a cathedral wasn't the most attractive thing to say. The cathedral was full, and we did two of these visits. One was in Armagh, hosted by Richard Clark as primate, and then I hosted another visit with the Bishop of Tuam in Limerick and Killaloe, and they were had much more impact than I expected. So I think the church has done it, but they do it in terms of straight relationships. Strong, straight relationships, and they work at it and they're sustained. So we have some experience with that, and I think that's one of the areas the church can contribute seriously.
So, and I think the two principles I take from what you've shared there, Bishop Kenneth, one is about the sort of relationship building, particularly at sort of the ground up. And so finding people who we can connect with in another context and actually finding ways to build those relationships. The other is actually recognizing that within our churches, our resources of people who come from a different context to our own, who we could be listening to and helping us to understand the context that isn't ours, but that is other people's context. Those would be two principles I'd take from that. So thank you. Who's going to pick up the baton next?
Well, I'd be happy to say a few words from my context. And we're in a rather unique position because we represent English people living in Europe. Our churches are international churches, but there's a good number of English people amongst them. And so our folk are always in a minority position, and they're vulnerable. And they have to represent their country to a degree with the peoples amongst whom they live. And that is a very important exercise. And so as a church, we're supporting people who are living with the reality of Brexit and the reality of the tensions and the broken relationships, and having to sustain good relationships locally with their local political authorities, with the mayor, in the face of all of that. And they do. At my own level, a good deal of my time is taken up with forging and sustaining relationships with peers across Europe. So just a couple of days ago, I went down to the far south of France to meet the Bishop of Montauban, Bishop Genoux, who's the co-chair of the Anglican Roman Catholic Dialogue in France. It's a long way to go. I spent 3 hours with him, but of course, making that effort, going onto his territory, speaking French with him because he doesn't speak English, that is a way in which I can demonstrate the seriousness with which I take our relationships. Our churches are constantly working alongside and with Protestant and Catholic churches, and we do face in two directions, a bit Janus-like, but we are neither solely Catholic, neither solely Reformed, and in a number of European countries that is a significant advantage. Where sometimes, well, if you take France, I mean, there's still quite an edge really in the relationships between Protestants and Catholics in France because of the history, and we can speak to both parties there. So that's just a few ideas from me.
Yeah, no, that's lovely, Bishop. And I think that one of the things that's highlighting is how sometimes being Anglican can be a blessing. That the context, yes, where we can be more natural bridge builders with both our Catholic and potentially other denominational groups. I guess the Orthodox would be the most obvious thing that's coming to mind in the sort of the context of Ukraine, but also the more Protestant traditions, and that we've got a connection with both of those.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, just to pick up on that, and we do have relationships with the Russian Orthodox Church simply by having the virtue of the fact that we have a church in Moscow. And we are absolutely dependent on Russian Orthodox support. in order to stay there. And so, navigating and managing that relationship at the moment is a really important question for us.
Yes. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Bishop Robert. Either Bishop June or Bishop Andrew?
I think I just want to reflect that the church always stands in the dilemma between is it there as an institution to bolster up stability and steadiness, or is it there to challenge in such a way that sometimes it's very disruptive, as we talked about earlier? And I don't think there's a perfect answer to that. What I would just comment, what Bishop Kenneth had to say about Ireland, I think is very important. I do not think we can assume that we are immune to civil disobedience. All the factors that are usually there when civil disobedience erupts are there at the moment. And we just have to take that very seriously, because we're not there just simply to avoid the issues that are going on. We are there to get stuck right into the middle of them.
Yeah. And my own sense would be that there's a both and that's needed. We both need a voice like Rowan Williams who's prepared to challenge the Russian Orthodox Church, but we also need to work at maintaining relationships with our Russian Orthodox brothers and sisters, and so we're having to live with that uncomfortableness of doing the both and on that. Would be my own sense. Bishop Andrew, anything you'd want to add?
No, I'd probably just draw it back to where we are in the Anglican tradition. So the very last bit of the question you asked us, our own role as a bishop, and we're preparing for Lambeth, which suddenly feels really, really close. I don't quite know exactly how it's going to work out with the state of pandemic, but the relationships that we have as bishops in our own Anglican churches, our own contexts, that was there before the last 15, 20 years. I really hope and pray there will continue to be bishops in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Europe, all over the world, 20, 30, 40 years hence. So I think we maintain those relationships by dint of being Anglican bishops, by being in communion, and we disagree violently on all sorts of things, even just within our own Anglican communion. That's great. That's the joy of it. I was always in a breakout room with Canadian bishops and all the preparation we've been doing, and we all felt we were on various naughty steps. So we disagree about all sorts of things when we're doing that, but we're still in relationship, and we can model that relationship and show that whatever difficult issues come along, we will navigate our way through all of that. So there's just by being bishops, by being in relationship, even being here today, the four of us here today are part of dealing with tensions across boundaries, I hope.
I think that's a lovely note to be drawing us towards a close then, Bishop Andrew. And I think, for as a not a bishop on the call, I think to kind of affirm that in that sense, you are representative for all of us. And when you do gather together for the Lambeth Conference and in other gatherings, that we are looking for you to, as bishops, to be the ones who will have those really honest conversations, will be prepared to challenge one another, but will also stay in relationship with one another, because I think that's the deep longing that we have for our churches and for the communities of which we're part, is that we can really have the difficult conversations, but we can remain committed to staying in relationship and to being alongside one another amidst all the challenges that we face. So Bishop Andrew, Bishop June, Bishop Kenneth, Bishop Robert, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been a real joy and a privilege to listen to you, to be in conversation with you. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you to all of those of you who've showed up. I really hope you've found the conversation as stimulating as I have. Do get in your diaries our next webinar, which is on Tuesday, the 20th of September. So it's in the early autumn, on addressing poverty today. We're hoping to be joined by two other bishops, Bishop Philip North, who's the Bishop of Burnley, and hopefully Bishop Lynn Cullins, who's the new Bishop of Barking, as well as Delene Mark, who's CEO of Hope Africa, and we'll be bringing us an African perspective on poverty. And Andrew Grinnell, who's part of the Leeds Poverty Truth Commission, will be giving us a sort of very grounded kind of perspective from Leeds. So do get the 20th of September in your diary for our next webinar. Bishop Robert, would you be kind enough to draw us to a close with a prayer before folks say goodbye?
Let us pray. God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. Father, you send us to be ministers of reconciliation, drawing folk together. We're aware of the huge difficulties, tensions, and anxieties that characterize our continent today, and indeed our wider world. Please strengthen us by your grace to be agents of reconciliations, ambassadors for Jesus Christ. May we go out from this meeting with your peace in our hearts and your words on our lips. May your blessing be upon us for the remainder of this day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bishop Robert. Thank you all for joining us. Time to say goodbye to all those who've joined us, or attendees on the call. Thank you so much for showing up. There will be a recording of this available in due course, which you can flag up to your friends. So we'll do it once everyone's gone. We'll do just a sort of brief debrief with the bishops. But if you want to sort of head out now, if you're one of the participants, and Debbie will find a way to help you to leave if you're not able to do that on your own.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
I can't go again.
I think that's all our participants have gone, haven't they? Is that right, Debbie?
Yes. Just checking. Yeah. And I think you can stop recording now, Joe, as well.